After sending their best invasion fleet, the Degenerate were confused. Why hadn't they heard anything back from their fleet? It should have been over already. So they sent out scouting parties to find out what happened. Maybe it was something simple as there was some sort of magnetic interference that they didn't understand. But for some reason, the scouting ships never returned. The only reports they received back was a strange mechanical warning, a warning for them to stay away. But as they went closer to get some sort of intelligence, suddenly the scouts would go dark, and no one could figure out what was going on. This was until one of their scouts came back and said they had jumped in and realized that there was debris from one of the scout ships just drifting in the ether, which passed by. Once they confirmed it was their ship, their captain did a, "Oh, hell no," and left. As the rumors spread of the loss of the fleet, the Deschnevik were having trouble getting pushed back from their stalemate against the Queshfart. Once the strongest, now they were on the defensive as they had lost their most prized fleet to include one of the few dreadnoughts in existence. And with the loss of the dreadnought, along with multiple battleships, along with their escorts, they were forced to the defensive line. They were no longer able to push into other territories and dispute them, but instead trying desperately just to hold worlds after an extreme amount of loss of not only ships, but some of their best personnel were now just gone. Trying to figure out the next move, they would have to wait and get more intel and figure out, is it worth trying to push? Is it worth sending more ships? Is it worth it? Sending another scout, but this time in the form of a corvette class, one of their more advanced ships, and they dropped in out of warp. And they sent a call, but it wasn't the one that the Deschnevik were expecting. No, this one was a distress call, a scream about how there was a burst of energy heading their way, and they didn't know where it was coming from. It was only 2.1 seconds, and it was gone. There was nothing left. Scouts warped in and were horrified by what they found. The ship had been atomized. As soon as they confirmed this, they immediately turned their bows around and got the hell out of there with a grand total of, "Nope, we're not doing this." The only images they got at all were of some smaller ships. They couldn't tell if these were manned, if these were droned, what they were. A few small scattered images, a few small scattered vid components, and that was it. That's all they had. Because of this, rumors went around. Rumors continued to bounce around because they didn't even know what they were facing. They believed there was a biological race there, but judging from the warning they got, which was clearly a mechanical voice, they wondered if it was biological or mechanical. But as they looked close on all the ships that they did get images of, there was something obvious. There was no decorative, there was no flamboyance to the ships. This was normal for anyone who reached to the stars to have some sort of decoration on their ship to show their glory to all. But no, there was nothing. As this question pondered in the ether, the other factions were thinking about getting into play. However, the Polshiter were in no way, shape, or form ready to jump across two different factions' territory to actually get at the Soul Sector. They would have to fight their way all the way through the Queshfart, and they were already doing battle with them over disputes over different systems, which was normal to have brushfire wars. The last faction that was, the weakest one that no one really paid attention to, as they did not have that much in the way of resources. Plus, as far as everyone was concerned, they were a backwater faction and not really worth anyone's time. The Mogan Slute were looking into the Soul Sector. They were still trying to expand, trying to raise themselves up. The only reason they had not been completely absorbed by others is they were too busy as they fought over what they believed were the core worlds, the most valuable ones. This left the Mogan Slute alone, and they slowly, ever so slowly, built their authority. As is standard, the Mogan Slute sent probes into the Sol sector, but the only thing they received was messages. The same message over and over again. They continued to listen as they were questioning what the hell was in that sector. So they simply held position. The probe was able to hold position for a grand total of just over 5 hours before a sudden flash of light and the probe just stopped transmitting. They were concerned that there was a sudden energy spike. As they started to check over what little readings they had, the only thing that had this much type of energy was a supernova. They began to check all their charts and they realized that a supernova had not happened. But what the hell was going on? They continued further investigation on the mechanical voice, which was their biggest lead that they had. They were trying to figure out if it was in any way, shape, or form organic. Was it purely synthetic? Was it an amalgamation? They didn't know. So they waited, and they conversed about this, trying to figure out what their next move would be. Many decided that they wanted to send a recon group into the sector just to do a basic flyby to see what was there. Others were worried if this was a weapon that was fired at them. They did not want to be on the receiving end of it. So the diplomats did what diplomats do. They wasted time in committee. They wasted time for over a year as more probes were sent out in a vain attempt to get any more information. The best they got was a single picture matching the rumors of the ships that was there. It was an extremely distant picture. Even though their technology reached out so far, they were barely on the outskirts of the sector, and they were barely able to get this one ship. And with that, of course, they got the same message before the loss of their probes again. They couldn't figure out what was going on. They decided they would send one ship, just one ship, the fastest destroyer they had. They would send it. This would be stripped down of most of its weapon systems minus point defense and sent in. The reason they did this was to show that they were of no threat. This would limit the chance of them being fired upon. It also had the strongest engines they could even think about strapping onto a ship, which gave them the best chance to get in, get intel, and get the hell out. The Mogan Slute ship warped in at the edge of the sector, and immediately they heard the message. The message was on repeat. The message was simple. This is human territory. Stay out. That was all anyone needed to know. As they heard the message, they sent a request for an audience to those of the human. They were rumored to be an extremely powerful species, and the Mogan Slutes wanted peace with them. When they sent the message, all they heard back was the recording play again. After about an hour, they sent another message. We understand that you do not wish to join our faction, but we do wish to start friendly relations. Still, the same recording echoed through back to them. Eventually, another hour passed. We would like to confirm the strength and desire of this new species inside said sector. Along with this came a map showing exactly which sector they were talking about, as if anybody had any question. They sat back and waited for a reply, yet the recording is all they heard, and it continued. They waited, this time 6 hours. The captain was getting nervous as no probe had lasted this long. Perhaps they only targeted fully synthetic beings. Maybe they weren't around anymore. Maybe a supernova had taken them out. Sending another message, this time basically pleading. We of the Mogan Slute simply ask that you confirm our request, and on that we will leave peacefully from your sector. Please respond. Please. With that, the recording suddenly stopped, and there was nothing but silence. They waited, sitting out there in the ether for another 30 minutes. Suddenly, their sensors went absolutely haywire, and their engineer screamed about some sort of energy spike. Then suddenly a massive beam of energy and particles passed by within 500 meters of their ship. The energy output would have been enough to vaporize almost the entire ship in one strike. And at 500 meters, that was like grazing someone's ear in space combat terms. The crew immediately began to prep to leave, going through all their startup processes. The captain, shaking almost uncontrollably, started yelling at the crew, demanding them to stay at their station, stand by, do not move, stand fast where you are. The captain believed they had missed deliberately. This was a warning shot. The captain, shaking up, trying desperately, reaching up with their third hand, trying to make sure that she could actually touch the button to send a message. The captain steeled herself, tapped on the button, and asked again, "Humans, we understand that you are hesitant. Please confirm your intentions. With that energy that you released, we understand your military might, and we will not stand against you. But we ask again, your intentions." With that, again, silence filled. 15 minutes. 15 minutes is all they had to wait. 15 minutes, and there was another energy spike, but this one was nothing compared to the first one. They all looked on their sensors, and the cameras were activated as a massive ship suddenly blinked in within 800 meters of where they were. It was massive compared to their destroyer that was scraped down to look like a recon vessel. They looked up and they could see all the turrets, many of them gleaming as though they had just come off the shipyard. There wasn't a single part of this ship that wasn't some sort of practical. It either had their weapons, their escape pod, obviously missile and torpedo launchers, what looked like drop pod launchers at one point, a beta launch fighters and shuttles out. This thing was truly a warbird. And as they looked at it, the entire crew began to shake uncontrollably. Some passed out. Some had to grab their carapace and hold themselves tight. Others had to pull their tails in as they went in their version of the fetal position, totally petrified at this ship that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. And it was just there, floating in space, 8 times larger than their ship. And it was definitely ready for combat. The captain was absolutely mortified at this, believing that this would be their last moments, but then realized that the ship had not activated its weapons, had not turned its turrets, had not opened its launch bays. No, it was just there. This was odd. That is until a mechanical voice came in through their radio. "This is Captain Allen of the HSN, Human Space Force Navy, the HSN Eldred Light Escort Destroyer." Everyone on board the alien ship suddenly realized how screwed they actually were. They looked and realized they were inside their own version of a destroyer, but what these humans considered a destroyer was akin to one of their battleships. They were truly, truly mortified at this. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then the mechanical voice continued. "We have answered and arrived as a professional courtesy." The captain once again had to steel herself as she reached up, wiped her jowls as she realized she was drooling, something her species does when they're afraid, and then answered. "We wish for you to answer our questions that we sent before about military standings and your intentions." The voice responded, "Our military strength is no concern of yours. Our intention is to protect the security of our people and our territory." With that, a map was downloaded directly into their system. "These are the borders of our space. Never return. The captain was looking at the map and realized that the borders of Terran space would encompass one of her sectors, one of her faction sectors. The politician or leader came out of her, and immediately she asked, "Do you know that this sector here," she pressed a few buttons and sent it to the ship, "that this is part of our territory? It is unclaimed territory. We have already scouted it. It is not colonized. It is now our sector. Do not attempt anything, or we will remove you." With that, it seemed as though the human destroyer was beginning to move away, as though it was getting ready to jump again and didn't want the alien destroyer getting caught up in the wave. The Mogan Slute commander asked, "Sir, what would it be possible for us to begin commerce?" There was no response. "Well, if no commerce, how do we get in contact with you again?" "Don't call us. We will call you," was the only response they got. Moments later, the ship blinked away as though it just wasn't there. No portal, no anything. No warp for sure. It just seemed to vanish. In what was left, there was a cloud of energy that seemed to dissipate once it was gone. The destroyer just sat there, waiting, trying to figure out what in the hell just happened before returning home to report. Once the captain returned and gave her report, the faction decided that they would not lose any territory and they would immediately start colonizing the unused system. This should force the humans into talks. For this to happen, they would use limited military assets, as little as possible while they could still defend themselves, and also just to make sure they didn't piss the humans off. They would try to send as many young or retired military as possible, most of which would be used for intel analysis as soon as the humans actually showed up. At great expense, they immediately started sending groups down to terraform at least 2 of the planets, and the hardships abounded. The soil, air, water were all in need of severe cultivation. The air on one planet was basically acid, which required everybody to wear suits. The soil on both worlds was almost completely barren, and on the other world, the water was actually radioactive. This was due to the lack of a true atmosphere. Even though it was a massive financial strain, their work continued on the planets. They continued as they were waiting for the humans, and the faction spent more than they even could afford trying desperately to make sure the humans would talk to them. The only bright spot is that several of the species do well in these environments, at least for a while, which allowed them to start terraforming and cultivating a little bit better, though most of what they could do were in domed cities, forcibly sealed off from the outer environments, although thanks to the absolutely horrid conditions, these domes wouldn't last long, no matter how well they were built. They would just have to make do, building more and more domes, and rotating through as they went. 11 years. They did this for 11 years, waiting for the humans to arrive. 11 years. To humans, this was akin to only 6, but 11 years they waited. Eventually, human ships came into the system. The sensors picked them up immediately as they weren't trying to hide, not to mention whatever system they were using to blink in and out, to seemingly fold space around them, to teleport across, was easily picked up. The burst of energy that came off couldn't be disguised at all. However, as the ships began to move in, the faction forces received a message. Again, a digital voice said, "This is sovereign human territory. Prepare for resettlement," which was the only thing they got. Those on the planet looked at their sensors and looked up to the skies, just petrified at what they saw. And they were confused that the humans would send such a massive fleet to take them on, and with such odd-looking ships. Again, nothing decorative, It's though they were all designed with the idea of only practicality in mind. This was odd to them all, for sure. The single faction destroyer, along with the two frigates, were immediately told to stand down and await settlers with that deep, mechanical voice that always came through their speakers. It was never different, and they were starting to get used to it. The faction ships actually called out to the humans, saying that they did not have enough provisions to take the refugees, not even half of them. It wouldn't be possible. They would starve before they got to another habitable world. They were simply told again to prepare. They would have to figure something out, and they were starting to worry. The settlers watched as shuttles approached. They were amazed. They thought they would come down with warbirds, but no, these were shuttles. These were human shuttles. They'd never seen this design, this strange, blocky design. And they believed that eventually they would start blasting away at the settlers, blowing the domes apart with their unbelievable weapons that they seemed to have on every single ship. Some of them began to pray, some of them dropped down on their knees with some sort of hope, other ones held their families, others just stood there waiting for the end. But no one fired. No one fired at all. The ships themselves simply landed on the landing pads, linked up to the side of the domed cities, and as the doors opened, armored bipedals came out. They seemed to have a very heavy walk as they stomped their way across. Some of them held up speakers that spoke in the faction's language. It told the settlers to grab their personal items as they were leaving. Armored humans began to go into each and every dwelling, loading up what they could, along with personnel and equipment, and just brought it to the shuttles themselves. Everyone was amazed by this. They were simply moving with mechanical precision. It was a simple process. It was scary. It was horrifying more that the humans didn't talk. They didn't hear anything. They couldn't see anything. These strange machines that were walking through into houses, it was odd. As they did, one of them walked into a house and stopped for a moment as a mother was collecting her children. The one that had stopped looked left, then looked right, then seemed to look down and see an infant in their version of a crib, which was basically just a carving into the wall. The mother was petrified and almost in tears as she thought the human was simply going to consider the infant dead weight and crush it under that massive, massive armored hand that they have. The bipedal machine walked over, bent down, and with surprising care, picked up the child, blankets, bedding, and all, and carried it ever so carefully out the door and to the shuttles. This amazed the mother as her tears dried up. Her kids were starting to cry, but as they saw their mother get calm, they couldn't figure out what was going on. They simply followed this strange mechanical biped as it went to the shuttle and very, very carefully placed the child down. The shuttles were loaded and they were sent up to dock with the faction ships still in space. When the shuttles left, those next to a porthole watched as other very bulbous ships, it was though it was a ball with a fusion torch on it, was beginning to head down towards the planet at the same time. They passed each other, not seeming to care about the break in atmosphere as they began to go up and or down. This was amazing to them. They couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. The ships, the shuttles they were on, docked with the frigates, and the refugees found themselves being basically pushed out into their own ships. They immediately tried to find a place where they could sit down, as this was going to be a long and very unpleasant trip. The captain and his crew were all conversing with themselves, trying to figure out how in the hell they were going to feed a population this size. They weren't outfitted for this. The ships were not ready for this. They barely had the ability to keep the air flowing so that everybody could breathe. How in the hell were they going to be able to process enough food, enough water, enough hygiene items for this? Then they received another shock. as the last of the personnel were basically shoved out of the human shuttles. They looked, and much of the supplies they had already harvested were being brought in, along with much of their farming equipment and everything else. They couldn't believe it. These big bipedals were simply walking in, holding their equipment like a lover would carry their spouse over the threshold, and simply dropping this multi-ton piece of equipment onto the floor, turning around and getting another one. Then they got an even bigger surprise, as several of the humans began to push in carts. These carts were not rolling on the ground, but instead using repulsor technology and were bringing in pallets upon pallets of supplies. No one could believe this. This was not anything they had. They didn't understand what it was. The humans simply stacked it all up like it was absolutely nothing, like this was another day at the office. They didn't talk. They didn't utter a single word. They just brought in more supplies that seemed to stack in wider and wider and taller and taller. They couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And then, as the last one came in, one of the bipedals simply walked with something in his hand. It seemed as though it was some sort of scroll or something like that. He walked up to just the closest sailor that was there, put the scroll in his hand, turned around, and left. The sailor couldn't figure out what the hell was going on, immediately opened it up and looked. It was written in his own language. It was instructions. It was instructions on what they had just dropped off. Enough food, water, hygiene, and medical supplies to get them back to their home station. What? He was so amazed by this, he didn't see his captain actually walking up next to him to find out what he was reading. Instead, he clumsily handed the paper over and started to explain what was going on. The captain didn't believe it as he ripped the paper out of his hand and began to read it. Sure enough, it was exactly what the other sailor had said. They didn't understand it, but on the very bottom of the paper, it actually said, "This is no longer your territory. Go home." With that, they were taking the advice and immediately began to start up their warp engines. It would take a couple of minutes for them to actually prep the engines and get in the correct direction for them to actually jump out. As they did, many of those inside ran to the observation deck as they didn't understand about these reports coming in. They immediately looked down through the glass and they could see that part of the planet, a planet that they had spent over a decade trying to heal, trying to make green, trying to bring any type of life, was already turning green. They couldn't understand how the hell did they do that. This was a species they didn't understand, but not only did they bring so much firepower that they could end the entire faction in just one battle, but now they can terraform entire planets? Just who the hell are they? What the hell are they? The mother that had worried about her child held the infant in her arms as she looked down and reminded herself that she was an intel analyst. She would have to report all this. But what the hell was she going to report? She wonders if they were even human or machines.